Duncan Carmichael, and we're broadcasting out again from Cape Town, South Africa. And for those people who were here last time, very sorry about the terrible internet connection that we had. We had an awful time of it, and we worked very hard at sorting that out. So everyone in our entire neighborhood has been banned from the internet. We've upgraded our line, and we've just done a speed test on it. We got 20 meg in and 20 meg out, so we should be all good to go. So thank you everyone for joining. If there's anyone who is joining us from an interesting place, as in your car or a train or a bus or something, that would be interesting. So if you could just type in and say, or a boat, or a park. It's always interesting to see how these things start to expand and people start listening to them and watching them on their mobile phones in different places and not necessarily at home on a laptop or a desktop. So that'd be interesting if you're coming into this show from a different place, from a different device, handheld device. That would be interesting to hear.
Tom Greenfield's on your train.
Tom Greenfield's on a train. Hello, Tom. That's great. Well, welcome. That's fantastic. I hope it'll be interesting, Tom, if you can just tell us by the end of this, if going through under all the tunnels and things, that you managed to get reasonable connection all the way through. That would be interesting. So let us know at the end. Right. So it's 6:30, and so we're starting now. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And I think the word's tuning in still, although that goes back about 20 years. So that slide up there is me, Duncan Carmichael. I'm essentially a clinician. My passion used to be hormones. It's really moved very much into genetics as well. My initial passion was adrenal fatigue, fascinated by it. Then it moved into thyroid, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterones. And so that then was my next. I think we just. Okay, I'm just checking. I haven't gone offline there, and I had a little. I pressed the wrong button. Okay, so anyway, that's me. And then we moved into genetics, and we've moved into developing my DNA health. So we are representing my DNA health in these talks, but the talks are absolutely academic only. But we will, as I'll mention at the end, be doing 4 seminars next year where we will be in London and going through the whole of genetics with DNA health and how we feel it's appropriate for people today. The reason we started DNA health was because we felt that we couldn't get results from people who were just talking about genetics and weren't talking about epigenetics. And really the movement is towards epigenetics, and we wanted a system that was epigenetic driven. And so that's what my DNA health is. So today we're going to be talking about gene testing for detoxification, and it's a fascinating big topic. I'm going to try and do broad strokes. We'll be going through 3 main fields of things. We've got 1 or 2 questions in already, I think. If you do have your questions, please send them through. Megan, who is here next to me, will be fielding them, and she'll be shouting out a couple of them. And so we'll go through a couple of the questions as we can, either during the presentation or afterwards. So what we've got as well, we've got 2 poll questions, and this first poll question is sort of an introductory one. And the question is, what is the most important detoxification gene test? I'll give you a clue, there's not necessarily a right answer here, so it's more an opinion. And so glutathione, and I put there GSTT1. There's at least 3 popular glutathione gene tests we can do. Methyltransferase, MTR, methyl tetrahydrofolate, MTHFR. I put the 6771 up there because it is more popular than the 1298 one. And then CYP1B1 as one of the cytochrome P450 tests, one of the most important ones there. And the last one, gene testing, is not important, which for some people it won't be. So those are the questions, and so I will then move on from there and see if I can move that out the way. Okay, great. So then we will get the answers from that. There we go. So we're back to that screen there. So I'll just wait for those answers to come in. And in the meantime, I'm going to be talking, no, I'm not going to be talking about core message because we've got the answers there. So the most important detoxification gene test. So 27% say glutathione, GSTT1. Glutathione is absolutely essential, and I hope to point that out as we go along. My opinion is I'm not sure what the right answer is here, but I certainly think that glutathione is right up there. Methyltransferase, 8%, it is very important. It's central to the whole methylation cycle. Methyl tetrahydrofolate, the MTHFR 677, got 39%, so that's the winner here. And so the driver of methylation, methyl tetrahydrofolate, is probably the rightful winner. But glutathione and all its works are very, very important in the brain and the body. CYP1B1 got 27%, very important gene, possibly the most important of the CYP estrogen genes. And then gene testing is not important. I'm very happy to see that got 0%. So that's great, thank you very much. So that was the poll. All right, so the core message for tonight. How do we remove toxins? So we've got lifestyle with sleep, stress, exercise. We've been going through that in the first few webinars about the importance of lifestyle and epigenetics. Nutrition, the leafy greens will be very important. Probiotics, B vitamins, perhaps meat, red meats, but we'll go through that. Environment, removing EMR from cell phones, the electromagnetic resonance that we get, exhaust fumes, the positive effect of nature, mental outlook, anxiety, how anxiety affects your methylation cycle, meditation, positivity. But this really isn't enough. We know from the last webinars that obesity is very much on the rise, and we've gone through that, but cancer is on the rise. And really genetics is very, very involved with cancer, and more so epigenetics is involved with cancer, so our lifestyle and how that influences our genes. So we're going to go through that, and that will be really the core with a fair amount of detail in a couple of areas of what we're talking about. But not everyone believes in detoxification, so as good as Ben Goldacre, the Guardian journalist, is, there's a couple of areas where I think he's really overstepped the cynical mark. So he wrote a book back in the noughties called Bad Science. He's done plenty of talks, and he summarized part of that book in a article that he wrote on January 8th, 2005 in The Guardian. So I'm going to quote from a little bit of it because it's interesting and important, and we're going to be addressing some of this, and it's nice to have a bit of controversy. So to quote, so how are detox formulae supposed to work? There seem to be two main ideas. One is that while you go on your major exclusion diet, cutting out indulgences, or worse still, cutting out almost everything, you need the ultimate in micronutrient nutritional support. After all, if you're going to survive on cups of hot water and slices of unwaxed organic lemon for a few days, the argument goes you're going to need a bottle of serious vitamins to survive. The second idea is more peculiar, that potions can actually help your body get rid of toxins. There's certainly no evidence I'm aware of that eating a slightly unusual diet for a few days and munching on some vitamins speeds up the degradation and expulsion of any of these things and these products claim to help you get rid of. And it's not really possible to imagine what experiment you could do to measure whether they were having an effect on real people. Please excuse my dog just running past and barking. So what we're looking for in this, what we're looking for in this presentation really is stuff to answer those questions, and they're relevant questions, and it's relevant to be cynical about detoxification and potions and vitamins that you get flogged in chemists. So what we're looking for is evidence that we accumulate toxins. That'll be in the first part. Evidence that these toxins are actually toxic, also in the first part, and evidence that eating nutrients can speed up the degradation and expulsion of toxic products. And that will be the main part of the second half of this talk. So to start it all off then, the exposome, from the first webinar, everything that we do, we breathe, we worry about affects the surface of the genome. So you'll see on the left-hand side there we go, my pointer's working, there's the genome that we've gone through it, the chromosome, the supercoils, the coils, the histone protein particles holding on to those DNA double helixes and the DNA double helix itself. And then we look at the epigenome and the influence of everything we do, from fishing to smiling to breathing to eating, and how all of those influence the genome itself. And so, of course, we saw very much in the first talk how important methyl groups are in this process. And methyl groups are this essence of epigenetics, and that's the music that flows from the sheet music of the genome. And those methyl groups attach onto either the double helix or onto the histone molecules and either speed up or accelerate or accentuate the expression of the genome, or it slows it down. And that methyl group is so important. And so we'll see when we get to methylation how important that methyl group is. So to answer one of the questions, evidence that your activities actually affect your risk of toxicity, in this case, the FDO gene, which is the obesity gene that we also talked about in the first two webinars. So the obesity gene means that you are predisposed for the rest of your life to be obese. And obviously some people carrying the obesity gene, the FDO gene, are not obese, but if you are, then this makes losing weight really quite difficult. But by influencing your epigenetics, by walking every day, you reduce that risk factor by 30% according to this study on the bottom. And then by eating your greens, your methyl supporters, you reduce that risk further. So we're not going into loads of evidence to counter the accusation about detoxification, but certainly there's just one of many studies showing the influence of epigenetics on your genome, and in that case on obesity. So can we prove that substances are toxic? Let's take lead. So 100 BC, so in Pompeii, lead water pipes were used all that way back. Victorian lead water pipes, and then in pre-Victorian era, so Queen Elizabeth reported having lead poisoning from lead-based makeup contributing to her death. Victorian houses today may still have some lead piping, and lead piping in the UK has only been mandatory to be removed since the year 2000. So until quite recently, we were really quite exposed to lead. But what we found also in studies, and here's a study by Menke, showing that even at very low levels of lead in the blood, that we can be exposed to most damaging effects of lead. And this is the association in this study between low blood levels and increased all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. And of course, lead very much accumulates in the bone marrow and not just in the blood. And so it's very hard to measure how much is really sitting inside of us. Smoking is the next interesting toxin. And so obviously in the 1950s, us doctors promoted smoking to relax you. And I remember in the late 70s and 80s, the Camel adverts, which I was always very impressed with. But it took really 30 years for the anti-smoking lobby in the US to prove in court there was a direct link between smoking and ill health. So if we look at this stat here from the UK, it really shows how public awareness campaigns can influence positively our health. So this is a graph showing that smokers in the UK fell from 46% in 1974 to 19%, so below 20% for the first time in 2013. And that's fantastic. And then if we look at other markers on the graph, we see that in 1964 in the US Surgeon General report there, which I think should be at the bottom here, if you want to see the reference of it. The US Surgeon General reports linking smoking and cancer. And then in 1985, so 30 years later, or 20 years later actually, the US court case showing that smoking was damaging for our health, so proven in a court case. In 2007, smoking banned in public areas in the UK. 2005 it was banned in the US, and then 2013, that effect of public pressure, smoking drops below 20%. Mercury is fascinating, and mercury will come through quite a lot in this talk. And the thing about mercury toxicity is the symptoms are so diffuse, and if you look at them, and there's over 200, there's the fatigue. I mean, it's what a lot of people sort of come through with every day, isn't it? Irritability, outbursts of anger, poor concentration, eczema, anxiety, depression, timid, shy, poor self-confidence, allergy. So it really has a wide, diffuse range of symptoms. And so really with all of those symptoms, we should keep in the back of our mind mercury and toxin levels. And mercury's history in the last 15, 20 years is in 1995 in Finland, a study came out showing that men who consume local fish have increased methyl mercury in the hair and double the risk of heart attacks. In 97, mercury from a mother's amalgam fillings crossed the placenta and the breast milk in the baby. The Nahanes, that great Nahane study, 2001, showing that low levels of mercury causing illness. Then, very significantly, and to great applause, in January of 2008, on the back of these and some other studies, Norway bans amalgam fillings. Not to be beaten, Sweden were quick to follow, and 3 months later they banned amalgam fillings. And not to be beaten, the FDA had a good think about it and brought out a statement a year later saying that mercury is harmful to neuroendocrine system, and amalgam fillings are associated with this, but they didn't ban amalgam fillings. So fairly typically they dropped the ball at the last moment. But certainly mercury, there's massive evidence about the toxicity of mercury. And so that's something that's really taken time to get through to the general public worldwide. Persistent organic pollutants, and these are much more difficult to find big, overwhelming proofs of their toxicity. Certainly organochlorine pesticides, DDT, already in the 1950s in the States, it was known that DDT was toxic. It took a long time to exclude it, and you'll see a disturbing picture on the next slide to support that. Industrial chemicals, unintentional chemical byproducts, dioxins, furans, PCBs. And so really we are often grossly unaware and grossly uninformed of the damaging effects of chemicals. And there's chemicals coming out all the time, you know, and one of the most recent ones will be not necessarily chemicals but toxic, the electromagnetic radiation that we get from cell phones. And this picture just disturbs me hugely. So there's a truck on the beach spraying DDT to get rid of any of the mosquito larvae, and there's two very helpful kids walking into the fog and to help the men on the truck. So the most helpful of the kids are going to be suffering from DDT poisoning. But it didn't end in the 1960s, and e-waste dump sites in Nigeria are a huge problem. So the world dumps their computers in Middle Africa and other parts of Asia, and this photograph was taken by a patient of mine who came back with metal toxicity. And he's a photographer who went and took some award-winning photographs on these e-waste dump sites. And what he showed was that these computers would be brought in and they would burn them to take out the metals from them, and they would be inhaling the toxins. And he said that from 1 year to the next, you wouldn't see the same kids on the dump sites. They would be back at home, sick, ill, dying, really toxic places. And it's not just in Africa, it's in Asia as well. There's my brother-in-law Gavin a month ago in Singapore, and on that day there he is in his office wearing his mask because the pollution standards index, the PSI, was 160 that day, and you'll see on the right a photograph of the same time, the same day actually in Singapore, and by that night the PSI went up to 210. And so that's a big problem in Southeast Asia, that smoke from Indonesia that every year just spontaneously catches the light and then blows over the whole of Southeast Asia and causes major problems. And so if we look then at what is PSI, it's the Pollutant Standards Index, and it's a list of 5 and now 6 different chemicals that get measured. And there's many apps for it in every city in the world. In the first world anyway, you can measure your PSI. So if you think that in the middle here is PSI from Shanghai, that's another friend who's working there, and on that day, before we say that, so generally if you look at PSI in London, it's usually between in the green, so the top of good, and below 100 over there, occasionally going up into the orange. And so we saw that in Singapore it was at 160 going up to 210, but if you look here in Shanghai, it's sitting really very high in this day, almost up at 300, unacceptable levels. So the toxicity that we see, the air toxicity around the world, really is unacceptable. There's a picture of, which will come up on your screen now, of the pea soup fog of London from the 1940s, I think it was. And those fogs and those deaths as a result of them prompted the Clean Air Acts that we got later in the 1960s in the UK. But this study here shows that in 2007, diesel exhaust plus a raised cholesterol negatively affects the very genes of your body. So there's epigenetics, the effect of the diesel exhaust. So 1,500 bad genes were turned on and 759 good genes turned off. Mobile phone radiation exposure, so we've used them widely for 30 years. Do we know enough about them? No, of course not. There are growing studies showing the increasing damaging effects of mobile phones. It's still not a slam dunk subject or topic, but certainly in this study you'll see, if you just look at the bottom part, the odds ratio there, use of cell phone once a week or more for 10 years, the odds ratio was double of getting a glioma. So we just need to use a phone once a week or more and it doubles our odds ratio of getting a glioma. So then if we look at the latest government report from the UK, brought out in August of this year, we see what the leading causes of death are. And if we look, typically we'll expect to see it right on the left that the head leading cause of death is heart disease. But if you compare it to 4 years ago, it's come down slightly. But number 2, and very close to number 1, is cancer. And so cancer, if you look at the incidence of cancer in the UK, it has been increasing over the last 50 years. And if you look at its percentage place on the leaderboard of leading causes of death in the UK, it really is almost overtaking heart disease as the number 1 cause of death. And I expect it to, in not just the UK, but a few countries. And that's a statistic worth watching. And if we see in the orange at the bottom here from this study that 5 to 10% of cancers are due to genetic defects, and 90 to 95% of cancers are due to lifestyle factors, smoking, diet, alcohol, sun exposure. So epigenetics. So the importance of epigenetics in this very important topic is absolutely massive and can't be ignored. And so, although cynical, I do always quite like this cartoon, and really is true that while industry puts profit ahead of our health, we are sort of quietly eliminated. But happily, in today's world of social media and our ability to have webinars across the world and spread information quickly and easily, hopefully we will be able to get on top of these topics more quickly. So, our main detoxification system, so the liver. So we're going to be really focused for the rest of the talk on the liver and how we detoxify the body. So you've probably heard it before, but I quite like this analogy. I quite like to keep things simple because that's the sort of person I am. And so I compare the liver to how we take rubbish out from the house. So it's a two-phase system. It's no point just emptying our bin under the sink and taking it and dumping it outside. That just attracts flies. We have to do the second phase as well, otherwise we just get a toxic house come from the fumes from outside. We need to take it away in the truck to remove it. So just like that analogy, our liver metabolism of, and we're going to use estrogen as our example, is a two-phase system. So typically within the liver, and bear with me if you're at an advanced level and you've done this many times, but it will speed up. But for those who haven't done it, phase 1 of the liver is the hydroxylation and very much the cytochrome P450 enzymes, the CYP enzyme, cytochrome P450. So that's phase 1. So we take our product, estradiol, it needs to be taken out of the body, and with these CYP enzymes, we take it to an unstable intermediary. And that's really important because often, in 20 years ago, I would have people coming in going on an apple detox or an apple juice detox. And we would really just take vitamins, which help with phase 1 of our detox, and push them into the unstable intermediary. And not surprisingly, on day 2 or day 3, they would get their Hertz reaction, i.e. Too many toxic, unstable intermediaries. And so we didn't focus on the phase 2. And that really in the last 20 years has become our focus, the importance of phase 2. These are the conjugation reactions, and you're taking that unstable intermediary and you're pulling it out into a water-soluble compound that can be then pulled out the body. So if we're going to detox, we need to do it properly. It needs to be a balance of phase 1 and phase 2. There's no point in just taking a whole lot of apples and hoping. You will get a headache on day 3. So to take this a little bit further and slightly more complicated, there's our estradiol, i.e. estrogen, our fat-soluble toxin, and it's a toxin because we want to get rid of it, and we're getting rid of it through phase 1 through the cytochrome P450 system, and that typically with estrogen is the CYP, i.e. cytochrome P450, CYP3A4, CYP1A1, and CYP1B1. And so, sorry, that's my dog again, and the puppy. So that's the phase 1 side of things. And so that will then take it to the 16-hydroxy, 2-hydroxy, and 4-hydroxy estradiol. Okay, so the point is it's formed a hydroxy. And if we were doing estrogen, we would then learn that that's a potentially bad one, that's a bad one, and that's the good one that we want. But really what we want to focus on is phase 1 is the CYP reaction, the cytochrome P450, and we've got 3 genes to choose from, the 3A4, the 1A1, and the 1B1. And then after that, we go from this unstable intermediary to taking it out of the body. So we will then move to our phase 2 of things. So phase 2 is the important bit, and this is the difficult bit, and this is the bit that we don't get right and we have to work on. So phase 2 is generally the conjugation phase, which is methylation or glutathione. And those 2 pathways, the methylation and the glutathione pathway, we have an option of either of them, will take this unstable intermediary, this 2-hydroxy, and by methylation, we'll be adding a methyl group, we'll take it to 2-methyl-hydroxy estradiol. Or down this pathway, 4-methyl-hydroxy estradiol. And on this pathway, it just does its own thing. It's different because that's what light's about. It doesn't have to be methylation, though. We could use the glutathione pathway as well. And we saw from the poll earlier that this was seen as important and this was seen as important. They both are very important, probably more important, though. So that's estradiol going through phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification. So the cytochrome P450, that middle pathway is the happy one that we want to focus on, and then in phase 2 the methylation or the glutathione pathway to take it to the end of phase 2. And that generally is what is seen as the complete picture of removing toxins from the liver. There happens to be a silent phase 3 that is really quite important. And the silent phase 3 is taking that water-soluble molecule and pulling it out of the body into the gut, because it doesn't just sit there forever. And calcium D-glucarate is the vitamin or the supplement or the element that is seen as being incredibly important for assisting in pulling it out into the gut. And then once this metabolite is in the gut, it needs to be attached to something and pulled out of the system so it doesn't absorb back into the system. And so our probiotics or our flora are seen as essential in that. So you could really see phase 3 as being the calcium D-glucarate and the probiotics. So if we're going to complete our detoxification of the liver, we need to make sure that our gut is in a healthy state as well. So there, in a nutshell, is phase 1 and phase 2 of estrogen through the CYP pathways. That's the happy, healthy one we want. That's an unstable intermediary over there and over there. And then through our methylation pathways, or methylation and glutathione pathway over there, to take it to this happy end phase, which can then get pulled out of the body via this glucuronidation. So there were a couple of questions after I think the first webinar about this. I've gone into that in a little bit more detail, and I hope that's useful. That's the phase 1 and phase 2. And from there, we're going to move into glutathione pathway, and then finally the methylation pathway. And that will sort of conclude the talk today. So if we look at the genes that are involved, in fact, let's go even further back. And this is one of the difficulties of webinars, is that you can't tell how happy everyone is with the speed you're going. So if I'm going too fast or too slow, just send through a message, and so I can have a look and see, and we can speed it up or slow it down. I think this is quite interesting. So these are all our genes that we generally look at if we're looking at liver detoxification. The methylation genes that we'll get into, the glutathione genes, GSTT1, GSTM1. There are other ones, but I feel those are the most important. Our cytochrome P450 genes, CYP3A4, which we don't do as a gene test because there's 20 different alleles and it's not worthwhile doing. CYP1A1, that isn't in yellow here because the others are all associated with being low penetrance gene for breast cancer. That's the one we want to encourage. That's the good one, but it is a gene we test. CYP1B1, which takes estradiol down this slightly unstable pathway. And so those are the genes that we really focused on for the low penetrance genes for breast cancer. And so if anyone comes to our clinic and there is a history of breast cancer, or they're concerned about it, concerned about going on to our bioidentical, so natural HRTs, we would do these gene tests. And I like everyone to do the gene tests, just to see where they stand, where their weaknesses are, and as with everything in epigenetics, what we can do to correct it. But I just want to take us back a bit down this pathway as a little detour back to pregnenolone. And what you'll find is that a lot of people don't have CYP17. And so for many years, I wondered why with my adrenally fatigued patients, I gave them pregnenolone. It didn't help. It didn't convert into DHEA. And the reason is because CYP17 is a bit of a problematic gene. You can give pregnenolone for the brain, for acetylcholine at high doses, it helps. But in my experience, not particularly useful. There's better things for your adrenals. So that's just a little aside. I'm going to leave this. So those are the low penetrance genes for breast cancer. Premarin HRT comes in a very difficult place. That's why Premarin and the Women's Health Initiative was so problematic, because people with these negative genes were highlighted in that study. And I want to move on to the nutrients that can help these different spots. We're going to be have this webinar available and the slides available later. So you can get a hold of the slide. This slide I find is particularly useful, and it shows the different nutrients for the 3 different main pathways here that either have a negative influence on that pathway, i.e. slow it down, or a positive influence on the pathway, i.e. speed it up. So if we're talking about estradiol, we want to speed up some of the pathways and slow other ones down. So if we just on this slide focus on our phase 1 enzymes, then CYP1A1 is sped up with cruciferous vegetables, moderate exercise, protein, and omega-3 fatty acids, all good things to take. CYP1B1, that we don't want to encourage for estrogen, is slowed down by DHEA, polyphenol, resveratrol, flavonoids, and green tea catechins. So as far as estrogen is concerned, we want to slow that pathway down. On the other hand, in green, cigarettes, dioxins, and PCBs all speed it up. So let's leave that point there, and you can have a look at the other supplements all the way across there as well. Let's leave that point there, and then let's sort of move on from there to here. Now, if we were looking at other things apart from estrogen, obviously plenty of other products go down these pathways. So if we look at the middle pathway, so forming the 2-hydroxyestrogen, that pathway is also used by coffee and cigarettes. So this is a CYP1A1 pathway, and we saw in the first presentation CYP1A2, which is a very similar pathway. So coffee and cigarettes upregulate that pathway. then if we look at the bottom here, mercury and lead go down this pathway. So we might want to down-regulate this pathway for estrogen, but we do want to get rid of these products from the body. And so by down-regulating it too much, we may slow the removal of mercury and lead from the body. Similarly, on the top pathways, so the CYP3A4, paracetamol and other tablets get passed down that pathway. So we may want to switch this off for estrogen health, but for removing tablets, we want to perhaps turn it on. So it is a little more complicated than we would sort of think at first, and that sort of gives the different reasons why one might want to epigenetically slow it down or speed it up. So then if we look down at the bottom here, the glutathione pathway, we've got some products which will help to form glutathione, because glutathione is given as an intravenous drip generally, and it's quite hard to give orally, although Zymogen and one or two other companies do have a stable glutathione orally. But generally we'll be giving N-acetylcysteine, alpha-lipoic acid, glutamine and milk thistle, all which help to make glutathione in the body. So if we look at that pathway, we look at the pathway that removes heavy metals, and we look at chelation, which is the traditional method for removing heavy metals. So if we look at it, we will go then, and generally we will, if we've got heavy metals in the body, what we would do is 15 years ago I would give EDTA, DMSO tablets, alpha-lipoic acid. And what these chelators will do is they will remove the metals from the body, but at the same time they leach minerals from the body. And if you don't give a continuous stream of these chelators, there's a danger, particularly with something like alpha-lipoic acid, of those metals leaching back into the body or re-inoculating back into the body. So you lift them out of one organ, some of them leave the body, but others fall back into the body. And that was always the big problem with chelation. It also puts a strain on the immune system, and people with adrenal problems, they struggled with it. So in our quest to remove metals from the body, we looked at other opportunities and ideas. So the question came up, if two people are exposed to mercury, why does one person get mercury toxicity and the other doesn't? And the answer is because one person has an unhealthy glutathione pathway, and the other has a healthy glutathione pathway and can pass the mercury out of the body. So about 15 years ago, Patricia Kane, who's I think a famous, a very famous American natural physician, came up with a concept of glutathione drips. So I credit her with glutathione drips. And glutathione drips was then seen as the safer way of removing heavy metals. And we in our clinic will now very rarely do EDTA, and we will tend to stick to glutathione drips. So intravenous glutathione, methylation supporters, phosphatidylcholine, because we'll see it's also part of methylation, and it also opens cell membranes, to stimulate the body's own detoxification system. And so for the last 5 years, we have been using glutathione drips very successfully to remove heavy metals from the body. Glutathione has further roles than that, and I don't want to linger on it too much, but glutathione is an essential antioxidant within the cell. So within the cell we have the SOD, superoxide dismutase, as the antioxidant, and the glutathione pathway as well. And remember, glutathione works on a redox reaction, so very much involved as an antioxidant. Within the brain, it is the brain's #1 antioxidant. It's absolutely essential for removing inflammatory products within the brain. So rightly so, glutathione took second place in our poll as the most important of the gene tests to do. So then lastly, we're going to get to methylation, which is probably the most important pathway in the body. So if we look here, we've got our phase 1 and then our phase 2, and within phase 2 we have methylation. Now methylation can become a very deep dark hole which you can keep on going down and can be more and more confusing as you go. So what we're going to do is broad strokes of methylation with a little bit of detail. So we're going to go into the methylation pathway, this phase 2 very important pathway, and just show what it does. It's not just involved in the liver, it's also very involved around the body. So, what is methylation? It's the process of donating a methyl group, so a carbon with 3 hydrogens attached, to a substrate. And that substrate will do different things. And it turns out that methyl groups are essential for all sorts of things around the body. So methyl groups are commonly donated to turn on and off genes. Well, we know that from the first webinar. It's the music, it's what drives the genome, it's the epigenetics. So we need methyl groups for that. Methyl groups are also used to form DNA and RNA. And if you see on the right-hand side there next to the arrow, you've got uracil there, and if you just add a methyl group to it, we get thymine from DNA. So methyl groups help to form our DNA. Chemicals, mercury, arsenic, they steal methyl groups, and it takes a lot of work to use methyl groups to get them out of the body. Alcohol blocks the methylation pathway at the MTR gene. Neurotransmitters and hormones, so the formation of serotonin, melatonin, dopamine, T4, all requires methylation. The metabolism and getting rid of estrogen requires methylation and COMT. Immune cells, methylation helps in the formation of natural killer cells, and if methylation doesn't work, we will see that natural killer cells then start to become less. Produce energy. Methylation is essential in making mitochondrial ATP, carnitine, and CoQ10. And nerves, methylation makes the PC, the phosphatidylcholine, which forms the myelin sheaths. So I quite like this picture, which just shows that first point, that without methylation, we cannot look after our epigenetics of our genes. Our 25,000 genes are exposed to epigenetic damage. And it shows quite nicely the food that we eat, so the methyl greens, that looks a bit more like pizza. So it's really just sort of the methyl green on the top there. Through folic acid, not a good choice of word, folic acid there, but it was a nice slide, so I'll put it in. And we'll go through why folic acid as opposed to folate is not so good for us. Then through methylation forms methionine, which forms SAMe, and that then donates via transferases methyl groups to the DNA. So very important. So sites of methylation, just to drum it in a bit further. Methylation happens in the brain, making serotonin, dopamine, and melatonin, and then removing serotonin, dopamine, and epinephrine. In the liver, where 80% of methylation occurs, removing estrogens, mercuries, our arsenic, plastic, alcohols. In the muscles, helping to make creatine. In the thyroid, converting T4 to T3. Many years ago, I used to give patients who had low T4 and T3, I used to give them T4 and T3. I still do sometimes. But now, more and more, we will support their T4, give them T4, and then give them methylation support to help them to convert T4 into T3. And that works very well. In the kidneys, to remove toxins. In the testicles, essential for spermatogenesis, the formation of sperm. And you'll see often in fertility clinics, people are offered zinc and folic acid when it should be folate, and to help with the sperm formation, the understanding that methylation is essential there. And then within the cell, so the making of cell membranes via phosphatidylcholine, within the mitochondria, we've gone through that, and the chromosomes, so driving epigenetics and actually making the DNA. So I think that's enough on highlighting really how important methylation is in the body. So let's go through methylation. Let's start with this basic slide, and we'll just build it up a little bit and get a bit more complicated as we go. So basic methylation, if this is your first time of looking at methylation, or you looked at it once, it was a bit confusing, just take this as the take-home message, that what we've got with methylation generally is homocysteine, which mixes with the methyl donor, methyl tetrahydrofolate, so folate, homocysteine, which then with numerous different enzymes grabs that methyl product and takes it and converts it all the way through to SAMe. SAMe is there because it then is the product that's able to donate the methyl group via these transferases for what the body needs it for, which is what we had in the last few slides. So homocysteine takes methyl groups from methyl tetrahydrofolate, donates it to SAMe, and SAMe can then give it to the body. And that is what the methylation cycle is all about. There's a few enzymes, a few cofactors and things shown along the way, but that is basically what it's all about. So if you take home nothing else, take home that. So if we look at some inhibitors of the methylation pathway, then it's quite interesting to see that antacids deplete B12, and so will deplete one of these cofactors. Toxins, alcohol, will block part of this pathway. Arsenic and mercury will leach methyl groups out of here. Niacin, vitamin B3, will use up SAMe and remove it. An excess of SAMe, on the other hand, will give a negative feedback back to homocysteine. An excess of glutathione will give a negative feedback. So there's positive and negative factors, and those are some of the negative, on this methylation pathway. And in a bit more detail, the different toxins that suck up the excessive methyl groups are the arsenic, the mercury, the organophosphates, the glycophosphates, so Roundup, stress, and we'll look into that, and on one of the slides it shows where stress affects methylation. So the long working hours, the lack of sleep, high demands, no exercise, has a huge effect on methylation. Alcohol, mentioned that blocks this pathway at MTR. Cell phone radiation, chlorines, makeup, and plastic. So all of these toxins will tend to suck off methyl groups from this process and slow down our methylation. So then that was the basics of methylation, and if I can get this, there we go, the pointer to work. What we were looking at was taking homocysteine over here, which is what we measure when we do blood tests, and if it's high we say that methylation isn't working. And it was combining, in that first slide, the homocysteine with methyl tetrahydrofolate. Well, my pointer isn't working as well as it could. Okay. So combining with methyl tetrahydrofolate, so you'll just have to see that at the bottom of the green cycle, and taking that methyl group from methyl tetrahydrofolate and converting it up to the top of the red cycle to methionine, and then converting things to SAMe and donating the methyl group to the rest of the body. And that's what this is all about, is just donating methyl groups for use all the time in the body for the different things that we saw. And this methyl tetrahydrofolate will have to do a few things to come back to here and do its thing, and we'll see that there's another cycle here that helps the conversion of methyl tetrahydrofolate as well, which has an effect on some of the hormones in the brain. So this is the center of the methylation pathway, with effects that we will see within this pathway and brain effects that we'll see in that pathway. And that's really as far as we're going to go with this. So if we then go into a little bit more detail of that methylation pathway. So we're going to start at the very bottom, which is a very good place to start, with homocysteine, because we all know homocysteine. And then just show again how homocysteine mixes with methyl tetrahydrofolate, which we get from leafy greens, and methyl B12, so methylcobalamin, not any other cobalamin, methylcobalamin. So leafy greens plus methylcobalamin forms this transferase, MTR, methyltransferase, and that then carries the methyl group all the way to the top with the help of a bit of zinc on the side there to methyl homocysteine. So all we've done is taken homocysteine, added a methyl group, and make methyl homocysteine. Methyl homocysteine has another name, methionine. Methionine we get in protein, so in red meat, but we can also make it via this cycle. Methionine or methyl homocysteine, with the help of a bit of cofactor of magnesium, then has an adenylyl group attached to it and is now called S-adenylyl methyl homocysteine, aka SAMe. So all we're doing is adding little bits onto the homocysteine. It's still homocysteine, but now we've got a methyl group attached and we have a way of getting rid of the methyl group. The transferase then takes that methyl group and donates it to the body. That S-adenylyl methyl homocysteine loses the methyl and so becomes S-adenylyl homocysteine. So at the bottom there, SAHH, which then becomes homocysteine, and the whole circle goes on again. So that's the methylation pathway. Here in the middle, you'll see that only in the liver and the kidneys there's a shortcut. So we could do this shortcut where, with the help of choline, which we get in eggs, meat, quinoa, and beets, and with a bit of help of zinc, we can go up through the BHMT and make a shortcut to methyl homocysteine. So where it happens in 80% of a methylation, we can use this shortcut over here. Okay, so that's methylation. And so if you, at an intermediary level, and that is all sort of fairly new stuff, then really take that slide and stay with that, because that has a lot of methylation in it. But if you want to go advanced, if you want to take it a bit further, without confusing things, then I'm going to try and do that now, and we're going to then move a little bit into the folate cycle in the middle there, and the BH4 cycle, so the biopterin cycle over there. So we're going to take the same methylation pathway and make it a little more complicated. So we've got homocysteine here, there's a sulfur thing happening down here, which we're going to ignore with the CBS gene, but we're taking this homocysteine, we're mixing it with methyl tetrahydrofolate and with a bit of methyl B12, and taking it and making it into this transferase, so this methyl transferase. With a bit of help then, so MTR, converting to MTRR with methylcobalamin B12, that then remakes the MTR. But that MTR then goes up to form methionine at the top, then with the help of magnesium, down to SAMe, and then the transferases push it into the body. Now the first thing I want us to look at is that this is where stress affects the methyl cycle. So stress blocks these methyl transferases. So with stress we may be making the methyl groups, but we're not releasing them to the body. So that's the effect of stress on the methylation pathway. The next thing I want us to do is, if we come back round the cycle, what happens to poor old MTHFR? We don't seem to talk about it. So it comes up here, donates its methyl group, and now it's just tetrahydrofolate. It's that one over there, which then, with the help of BH2, so this biopterin, converting to BH4, then, and the help of a couple of things over here, then forms MTHFR again. So MTHFR converts back to tetrahydrofolate and then keeps on going around this circle. Now, importantly is, how do we get our folate? And that was a question that we got earlier as well. So we can get folate, in theory, from folic acid, which has been in plenty of supplements for the last 30 years. Green leafy vegetables, which is where we get folate from. So folic acid being a chemical, folate being the reference to the natural folate, green leafy vegetables, and then leucovorin, which is folinic acid, or methyl tetrahydrofolate. So those are our sources of folate in the body. Now, first up to say that if we have a problem, a genetic deficiency with methyl tetrahydrofolate, we really shouldn't be taking this stuff, or we take green leafy vegetables. But we should most definitely not be taking folic acid. If we have an MTHFR problem, then many of us, including me, have a problem taking folinic acid. Folinic acid makes us feel not so good. We need to take MTHFR. So that's the first thing to say. Then the second thing to say is that folic acid is a slower downer. I don't know if that's a proper term, but it slows down this dihydrofolate reductase pathway, which is already a slow enzyme. So it slows it down, and then slows it down over there. So folic acid has a negative impact on this whole cycle around here. So folic acid is problematic, and I'll show you in another slide what happens when we get too much folic acid in the body. And then very much lastly, if we're doing super advanced stuff, this BH2, so this biopterin, to BH4, so tetrahydrobiopterin, this conversion here not only helps the MTHFR, but that BH4 is what then drives tyrosine to form dopamine, tryptophan to form serotonin. So BH4, this last part of the methylation pathway, is essential in the brain to form our two happy hormones. And then you'll see over here that these two enzymes, or as far as we're concerned, the two genes, COMT and MAOA, then help to remove the dopamine and serotonin. And there's various problems that come in if we can't form dopamine and serotonin. i.e. low mood and depression, and there's problems if we can't remove the dopamine with COMT, i.e. anxiety. So I won't go into that any further, but just to say that really completes the whole of the methylation pathway. I don't want you to look at anything on this slide except for the red stuff on the right. And what it shows you is that study at the bottom is one of a few studies that show that an excess of folic acid in the body, so UMFA, unmetabolized folic acid, depletes natural killer cells and can increase cancer. So that's quite a strong reason that we should never be taking supplements with folic acid. We need folate. There's a massive difference between folic acid and folate. And that dietary folate that we take, the uncooked leafy greens, not the cooked, but the uncooked leafy greens, the methyl tetrahydrofolate, the leucovorin, are all the active folates that can then drive the center of this methylation pathway. Okay, so within MTHFR we've got two genes. There's the MTHFR677, which is the gene that is mainly used to oversee the enzymes in the body, and the MTHFR1298, which is mainly in the brain. So if we have a deficiency in MTHFR1298, then we are looking at brain problems. If we have a deficiency in MTHFR677, we're looking at body problems. So currently within My DNA Health, we're testing MTHFR677. It's the most common gene to test. But at some stage soon, we will be bringing in the MTHFR1298, and that's mainly for the brain problems. And I've mentioned the BH2 to BH4 conversion, and then how BH4 drives this tyrosine and tryptophan to form dopamine and serotonin, and then COMT removes dopamine from the body. If COMT doesn't remove dopamine, it goes down this pathway and we get irritability. So the most important gene in all of this, the MTHFR gene, we said has got two types, two alleles, the MTHFR677 and the 1298. So these statistics from this study is quite useful. If we look at MTHFR677 heterozygous and homozygous, that's the RS number. 40% loss of function if you are heterozygous for MTHFR677. 70% loss of function if you are like me and you are homozygous for 677. Then if we look at the spread of this through different population groups, 25 to 45% of the population are heterozygous for this, and 8 to 18% are homozygous for this. And there's similar statistics through different population groups. You can quite rightly assume that 50% of your patients are carrying the MTHFR gene mutation, which really shows the importance of monitoring everybody and testing everyone once in their lifetime to see if they have this and other gene mutations. But if we're going to do one gene, it really should be the MTHFR gene that we're testing. So if we then look at the methylation map, these are all the different methylation genes that we could be testing. Right in the center of it is our MTHFR, which drives most of the methylation pathway. But these are all the different genes we could test. So what can we do to balance methylation? We know that lifestyle plays a huge impact. The stress, the toxins on methylation. So the first thing to do is to improve and optimize our lifestyle. So lifestyle, nutrition, environment, and mental outlook. But this is not enough. Cancer is on the rise, obesity is on the rise, and methylation is certainly implicated in that, particularly cancer. So the missing factor is genetics, and we ought to look and see what is inhibiting all of our optimal methylation. So the gene tests that we are doing currently are in pink, so the COMT and the MTHFR. Within the methylation group, that was methylation. So I'm obviously getting a little tongue-tied. Probably need some more methylcobalamin. And so the other tests that we are bringing in quite soon will be the MTR and MTRR gene, and those make up the most important of the genes within methylation. I'm going to go past that slide. It's just toxins and drugs to avoid. You can have a look at it afterwards. And then really finally, because we have run out of time, just mention the 3 different ways we can test toxins. So the first one is hair analysis, and this shows what has been accumulating in us for the last 3 months. It is useful, but my preference to that is blood testing. My favorite company in the world really is Acumen in the UK. They're not cheap, but they're absolutely fabulous. And the trouble is trying to get your patients in there. So getting your bloods accepted there. But they really give a comprehensive test of what's actually happening in your blood right now. And then the third way is gene testing, which is so important for seeing what are we predisposed to, where are our weaknesses, and what can we correct. So the common testing that would be done, that we do, would be the methylation, so MTHFR 677 and COMT, the methylation there. And then the test that we'll be bringing in, which will be in white, the MTHFR 1298, MTR and MTRR. And then the glutathione tests at the bottom, and then on the left, the CYP1A1 and CYP1B1. And hopefully now we can see why they're important. So, to end things off, with regard to gene testing in your clinic, could you answer this question that I don't do gene testing and don't feel it's necessary to start? Now, I've got longer questions here. Sarah, if you could just run these questions, because I'm going to read out the longer ones. And so let's just do that there and come back to this. I'm going to read out the full questions. We couldn't get all words in the poll, so I'm going to read out the full ones. So, point 1, I don't do gene testing and don't feel it's necessary to start. Point 2, I don't do gene testing but want to start and would only need the first tier gene tests of MTHFR 677, COMT, GSTT1, GSTM1, which is what we currently do. The third would be I do gene testing and I'm happy with testing only the first tier of MTHFR 677, COMT, GSTT1, GSTM1. And fourthly, I do gene testing and would find it useful to do the first tier plus the second tier of MTHFR 1298, so that's the brain one, MTR and MTRR, that's in the middle of the methylation pathway, then the CYP1A1 and CYP1B1. Those are the 2 important cytochrome P450 phase 1 tests. And 5 would be other, because none of the above's important. So if you could just answer that, and that will also help us with directing how we help you in the future with gene testing, so what's important for you. And if you do have any other comments on that and suggestions, you're most welcome. We really encourage you please to email through so we can field those questions and hear those comments. So remember, with gene testing, as always, what's important is the questionnaire. So one may have gene tests at the bottom here, MTHFR in orange, so heterozygous, GSTT1 in red, so homozygous, and one might think, gosh, there's a lot of problems going on there. But if the person in front of you or the questionnaire that you have is showing that the person is really quite healthy with regard to toxins, then those genes are not expressing. So the epigenetics is very important. In this particular patient, their toxin questionnaire gave them 2 points, so that's an average amount of toxicity. It's in orange. COMT was negative, so there's no problem with that. MTHFR 1, GSTT2, GSTTM1, 0. So their total was 5. So a moderate epigenetics and moderate gene weakness. So, to summarize then, everything together. So hopefully this is a slide we can pin up on the wall and have a look at. If we take estradiol through the liver, it's got to go through phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 are the cytochrome P450 pathways or enzymes. CYP3A4, not a great one. CYP1A1, our favorite one. We like that. CYP1B1 for estrogen, not great, but very important if we want to remove mercury. Coffee and cigarettes will help with that middle CYP1A1 pathway. It'll upregulate that pathway. Oh, apparently a lot of people didn't see the slide I'm going through. The summary slide. Yeah. Is it up now?
No, not that one. The one before this one.
Oh, the one before this one. Oh, the toxin testing one. Okay. So sorry about that. Apparently a lot of people didn't see the toxin testing, gene testing one. This is just really, so this is the toxin scoring from my DNA health patient, just to give you an idea of practically what you'd see if you were doing gene testing. So you'll see all the way down a whole list of different tests, and right at the bottom you've got COMT, MTHFR, GSTT1, GSTM1. And the COMT is in green, that means it's healthy. The MTHFR is orange, so it's heterozygous. GSTT1 is red, homozygous. GSTM1 is green, healthy. So you'll see on the right-hand side, very aware of epigenetics. So the toxin questionnaire was in orange was 2 points, so moderate toxicity on the questionnaire, and the combination of the points from everything else gave a moderate epigenetics and gene weakness. So the total of 5. So our assessment then of that person is they have moderately impaired genes and moderate expression clinically of those impaired genes. Okay, so Sarah, did the poll come through? There we go, thank you. So with regards to gene testing in your clinic, I don't do gene testing and don't feel it's necessary to start. 3%. That's absolutely fair. I don't but want to and would only need the first tier test, 48%. That's good to hear. I do it and I'm happy with testing only on the first tier, 3%. I do it and would find it useful to also use the second tier, 22%, and other 24%. Fine. Okay, so final slide. This should put it all together. I do tend to like graphs and figures and things. So estradiol over here has got a choice of going through 1, 2, or 3 pathways within phase 1. It's a cytochrome P450 pathway, so that's CYP3A4, not a great pathway for estrogen. CYP1A1, great pathway for estrogen, we like it, so there's a smiley face there. CYP1B1, not a great pathway for estrogen, but very important for mercury. So if we turn it off and down regulator for estrogen, are we impeding our ability to remove mercury and lead from the body? So that goes through phase 1, and then phase 2, our conjugation pathways are our methylation and our glutathione. So there's a methylation pathway, there's our glutathione pathway. Those are the supplements to support glutathione. Those are the supplements that generally are seen to support methylation. Remember, it's the methylfolate. We can't use folic acid. It has a negative effect in the body if it accumulates. It's methyl B12, so methylcobalamin, B6, zinc, magnesium. And then from there, there really is a phase 3, and that phase 3 is removing that water-soluble molecule from the body with calcium D-glucarate, and then making sure your probiotics or your flora is healthy to pull it out of the body. So, dear Mr. Ben Goldacre, let's think before we disregard the importance of detoxification. So just to repeat, there's certainly no evidence I'm aware of that eating a slightly unusual diet for a few days and munching on some vitamins speeds up the degradation and expulsion of any of the things these products claim to help you rid of. And it's not really possible to imagine what experiment you could do to measure whether they were having an effect on real people. So hopefully this series of slides has answered those questions, and things certainly have moved on since 2005 with regards to genetics, and genetics really have opened our eyes to these pathways and the importance of these detoxification pathways. So that's it. That's toxins and detoxification. If there are any questions, please send them through. We can try and get through 1 or 2 of them, and otherwise send emails. Have a think about it. We can always do emails in the future, and then next year we'll be doing 4 clinical days or 4 talks, so not the in-personal webinar, but really much more personal, where you can sit there and we can chat and ask questions and answer things and direct things as you like. So we'll be doing 4 full clinical days of teaching throughout the year with regard to my DNA health. So if you just get hold of Malcolm and Bernie and Sarah, we hope to help you further with that.
Can you explain to them what glutathione is?
Methyl saying, can I explain? Sorry, Megs is saying, can I? Methyl. Megan, my wife, is saying, please, can I explain what methylcobalamin is? B12. Okay, so methylcobalamin is the cobalamin that you get in meat, in red meat. There are cobalamins that you get, and the flora of your gut will make cobalamins, but it has to be a methylcobalamin. So you've seen in all of this that you need a methyl group, and methyl groups are what are needed for donation within this methylation pathway. So if you don't have the methyl group on your cobalamin, it is not useful within the pathway of methylation. So it needs to be a methylcobalamin, and you'll find in different quality products there will be a methylcobalamin. So it's worth looking for it on the bottles to see that it's not just cobalamin but a methylcobalamin.
Do you know calcium glucarate?
So calcium D-glucarate, yeah. What about it?
Safe?
It is safe.
To take continuously?
Yeah, I've never. So the question is calcium D-glucarate safe to take continuously? Yes, it is. We have it in our the detox formula that I like, and I find it very useful, safe. I haven't seen a toxicity problem with it ever. If anyone has seen toxicity with it, please let me know. But as far as I'm concerned, calcium D-glucarate is very safe, and you'll find it in quite a few of the good detox products. I think Nutrigenomic has it as well. I'm not sure about Zymogen, but yes. So I think it's most useful. But if anyone knows evidence to the contrary, please share it. That would be very useful.
Last question.
Last question.
What would you take to clear folic acid?
What would you take to clear folic acid? I don't know, actually. I think with time, it being a water-soluble molecule, it should clear on its own. I'm not sure what you take to clear folic acid, so folic acid overload from the body. I've always assumed it clears naturally on its own, and it's a matter of not pumping it in on a continuous basis with a cheap multivitamin or a cheap fertility tablet. But I think more and more in the last 10 years, it's become quite evident that we need our active folates, either from the raw leafy greens, from folinic acid leucovorin, or from methyl tetrahydrofolate. And with the methyl tetrahydrofolate, you need the L form of it. So it's L, capital L, dash methyl tetrahydrofolate that you need. Not just any old methyl tetrahydrofolate, and that then has the ability to get into the brain, so across the blood-brain barrier. It must be the L version of methyl tetrahydrofolate.
Someone also just said methylcobalamin helps to clear folic acid.
Oh, thank you. Someone's just said that methylcobalamin helps to clear folic acid. That's great. Thank you very much for that. Okay. That's great when you get questions and answers. It feels a lot more interactive and much more like we're all used to when we're in the same room together. So it's always more difficult when we're separated by cyberspace. Okay, I think that's it for the questions. Everybody, thank you very much for being patient through this talk. I hope it's been useful. And if you do have further questions, you're most welcome to email them through. I hope to meet as many of you as possible next year at the talks, and we will certainly take to heart what you said in the polls as regards to having new gene tests. So with that, I wish you a good evening and a good week further, and we'll speak to you in the future. Okay, thank you.